Hello, my name is Parker.
And my name is Ned.
And this is The Force Unlimited, yet another Star Wars Unlimited podcast. This is episode number 4. We're recording on December 10th. Tonight, Ned and I are going to talk about the Beatdown, and we're also going to talk about advantage in card games. But before we get to that, two notes. First, I want to apologize to the Star Wars Unlimited content completionists. If you are one of those people who feels compelled to watch all SWU content, we dropped 3 hours on you last week that was math heavy, and we acknowledge that we did that. Ryback, we see you. We're sorry. Second note, this is our first episode recording after launch. So we've started getting feedback. We're pumped. You love Ned, which is great. I love Ned. That's why I asked him to co-host a podcast with me. Also, the editing could be a little tighter, could be a little cleaner. I hear that. So tonight the editing is going to be both cleaner and tighter. Feel about the game we just played of Star Wars Unlimited.
It was interesting. I normally, despite my reputation as being someone who hates fun, I tend not to gravitate towards controlling decks, but I was definitely the control role in this particular matchup. But I was never under enough pressure that I felt super uncomfortable.
Tell me about the game. You played...
I played Tarkin. I played Tarkin Blue, and you played Urso Blue. So it was, blue,
that was my Bombay
blue.
Sapphire deck that came out of our conversation last episode.
And it was really good. Like, I think that throughout the middle game, you had basically permanent board control, and from turns like 6 through 8, it was 6 through 9. Or rather, resources 6 through 9, it was me just dropping fatty after fatty and watching as Yoda with a lightsaber went to town and just removed card after card.
Yeah, Yoda with a lightsaber, who I ultimately entrenched, and yet that still wasn't enough.
Overwhelming
that
barrage.
deck just that deck went off, and yet Blizzard AT-AT with a overwhelming barrage. I mean everybody went down.
No, you let it live. I mean, that was on you, I feel. Like, you didn't want to throw away your whole board dealing with it, but...
So then I threw away my whole board not dealing with it.
The whole board dealing with it. Yeah, no, that's the beauty of Overwhelming Barrage.
Yeah, and I mean, I tossed one turn Spark
one,
Rebellion, and it wasn't enough. That card, I'm very curious to see if Heroism gets anything close, but otherwise I feel like that card is something that's going to be one of the fundamental questions. Again, limited meta, but that's going to be one of the fundamental questions of the Spark of Rebellion at launch is if you're in a game with green villainy, are you prepared to deal with Overwhelming Barrage? I mean, that's going to...
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the topic that we're talking about today is why Overwhelming Barrage is so good, and why, honestly, I think at this point it is meta warping. Like, the fact that I see it in non-green and even like non-villainy decks is wild to me, because I don't see it in non-green, non-villainy decks, but even like with a 2-resource tax, the fact that it is the only big card advantage, board advantage combo card is hard, and I think we're going to talk about that when we talk into advantage.
It's the only card that allows you to casually remove multiple opponents' cards, and so even if we end up getting some sort of Wrath of God effect that wipes everything, then you still now you have to work around the symmetry. Whereas Overwhelming Barrage, every other answers one question, but the fact that it's Overwhelming Barrage and Palp, right? Those are the two. And what's terrifying is that some decks are going to casually run both, right? Like, and just pinpoint removal, many things. So, that's it was such a great game. Jin's ability felt great. Jin, I was running a Jin Jedi deck, so Blue Sapphire ended up being Jin plus every Jedi I could slam in there, and just to get that Jedi lightsaber. Because -3
super good. Yeah.
Just casually not taking damage when you attack is really good. But at the end of the day, the saddest, least, the coldest takeaway I think is that Overwhelming Barrage, really good.
Good card.
But let's get into tonight's topics. All right, so our first segment tonight, we're going to talk about who is the beatdown. I'm going to cover the short version, then Ned's going to walk us through it a little deeper. Who is the beatdown is a question that if you want to be a competitive TCG player, that's a question that you need to be able to ask in your given game. In any hobby, there are those threshold seminal questions that come up to kind of separate you into tiers of skill. If given my hobbies in cooking, it's do you know the mother sauces? In gardening, it's can you transplant something in the fall? If it's tabletop role playing, it's have you played literally anything other than Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition? but so in TCGs, the threshold question, one of many questions that kind of separate you into levels of skill is, are you capable of identifying the beatdown? So that phrase, the beatdown, as I understand it, also kind of means, are you the aggro deck? It ties back to a classic article, ancient article that I found, that we all found, that's hosted on Star City Games. And
it's actually from the dojo, which is wild. This is like proto internet, like it was on the internet, but it was back when the internet was like AOL, basically.
Like when you had to like BBS dial up or
no, past that.
Okay.
It was past BBS dial up. I was on dial up.
So I could go to Yahoo.
Yes.
And search for the dojo, and I'd get to the dojo.geocities.com or something. So,
but basically, it was a magic forum back in the dawn ages. Wow, yeah.
So it's an original article. It ties to Magic, but I think it literally any dude basher TCG. It's the same question where you're either the beatdown. I believe the terminology now has evolved to aggro, but you're either the beatdown or you're the control. And the beatdown's the person who's trying to win. The control player is the person who's generating value and will win if the game is going on long enough. And when you're playing a Tarkin red aggression deck, when you're playing Sabine, you assume you're the beatdown. When you're playing some sort of Luke vigilance heal weighted out deck, you assume you're the control. Those are the easy questions, but in some matchups, some mirror matches, now you still have to identify one player there's this objective truth. One player is the beatdown, one player is not, and being able to figure out, am I the beatdown, is a critical skill that you have to identify. And failure to identify that and then be able to play as the beatdown, be able to play faster, go faster, is going to cost you the game. And
yes.
Okay, so it's easy and obvious when it's Sabine versus Vigilance Luke.
Basically anybody. Yeah,
basically. Right. But when you're playing, some matches are closer, mid-range versus mid-range.
Yes.
Who's the beatdown? And even there's got to be some situation in some parallel universe somewhere, somebody is playing a Sabine versus Luke deck that, due to the nature of cards, Luke's the beatdown, right? Like in that turn.
Yes. Talking about the beatdown within a turn is, I don't think, as helpful. Although I do think it is important to know, like, when you have to turn the corner as control. At some point, when you're the control, you do have to say, like, okay, I need to move from not losing to winning.
Okay. So talk about it. So let's take over on the medium version.
All right. So I think the number one thing that we want to talk about when you want to talk about who's the beatdown is that it's a strategy informing decision. And what I mean by a strategy informing decision is that it's making choices about overall how you're driving the game. So examples of strategy, I think this was a really good one that came up in the game that we played, is focusing on clearing the board versus attacking your opponent's base. I would argue that in the match that we just played, I am a bigger deck than you are, and
Tarkin is a bigger deck.
Tarkin is a bigger deck than Jin, and so because Tarkin is the bigger deck, you need to focus less on clearing the board and more on attacking my base. Obviously there are exceptions and there's a lot, but the aggro player needs to focus on attacking the opponent's base. The control player is trying to keep the board clear. Another example is, how greedy can you play? That is, do I have the opportunity to wait and try and play my units for the maximal value, or do I have to play my units now to avoid dying, or to get the value out of them now? And both players, you can argue that this is less of a beatdown informed strategy question, but knowing your role will help you to decide how greedy you can be. And in general, as the control deck, you can be less greedy. You can wait less because since you are under the clock, you have to not die. And the assumption is that you are going to gain in value as the game goes on, so you don't have to try and squeeze the maximum value out of your cards, and you can afford to play them suboptimally to not die.
Okay.
Another control question is, do I deploy my leader? This is specifically a
When you say
slew
control question, you mean things that inform
Yeah.
strategy.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
A strategic question is, do I deploy my leader as soon as I can, or do I want to wait until I can guarantee that I'm going to get a couple of turns of value out of it? And the aggro player in general is going to want to deploy their leader as soon as they can because it's effectively a free card, whereas the control player will maybe deploy the leader quickly if the leader can help stabilize the board, but a lot of times they're going to want to wait, and they're going to want to wait as long as they can to avoid losing.
No, I mean that
Yeah.
tracks. I think on both the two of the two recently revealed leaders. You've got Jin and Ida
Yeah.
Versio, both of whom feel like leaders that Jin you only want to deploy if you're planning on not going face. If you're planning on doing a lot of exchanges,
Yes.
because her value only exists in more than one face exchange. I mean, her stats 4/7 is not the worst. It's respectable.
It's
Iden,
yeah.
likewise, triggers from spending an action to heal one if you've nuked somebody to just whenever you nuke somebody, heal one. So again, requires you want to deploy Iden and then drop your overwhelming barrage, or
Yes.
so you don't want to deploy them immediately if you're not going to be able to drive value. Okay, that's a strategic question. I get that.
Another example of a strategic question is, are there must kill units or must protect units? Is your strategy reliant on keeping a particular unit around? Generally, I think that strategies that involve keeping a particular unit around are not very good, but there are frequently strategies where you must kill your opponent's card or you will lose. So I would say, for example, with Jin, I had to spend a lot of resources to kill them because if I didn't, you were just going to get infinite value forever.
Well, flip side of the coin,
Yeah.
I had to kill Blizzard AT-AT. I did
Yes.
not, and it cost me the game.
Right. You know, Blizzard AT-AT is strong enough that with an overwhelming barrage, it would wipe your board, and so you have to.
I should have thrown more into. I was too greedy. Okay, so those are strategic decisions, but how do I tie that back into the question of who's the beatdown?
Right. So the beatdown informs your strategy. If you are the beatdown, your strategy needs to be an aggressive strategy because you are trying to win now. Whereas if you are the control, you are trying to not lose now. If you are the control, the longer the game goes on, the more advantaged you are. If you are the beatdown, the longer the game goes on, the less advantaged you are, but the more advantaged you are right now. And it's also important to differentiate strategy from tactics. Strategy is like your overall approach to the game, and then tactics are specific questions about how you do things for maximum effect.
Okay, Ned, I ask, looking at the script, do you have
Yeah.
examples?
I do. So an example of a tactic is, do you want to do the Han nonsense to play Han and a 6-drop on turn 4? So if you do that, you are losing a card from your hand. You're having to line yourself up such that you have Han, and you can, activate Han's ability to give yourself a temporary resource, play your leader Han, attack with Han to get yourself another temporary resource, and then play a 6-drop. And that only works if you have a particular configuration of things on the board. But that's an example of a tactic. Ken is lining things up so that you can do that.
I don't know that I recognize Han-related actions as anything other than Han nonsense, but okay, yeah, sure.
All right. Another example of a tactic is, which unit, if any, do I hit with open fire? If I have open fire, do I target the unit that has the most health that I can kill with it in one shot? So, like, for example, imagine that your opponent has Yoda and Greedo on the board. Let's say, right? Like, Greedo has more power. Yoda has less power. Yoda has more hit points. Yoda is a higher cost unit. So when I'm making the choice about which unit do I hit with open fire, that's a tactical choice. It's not a strategic choice. Your strategy might inform this. If you are, for example, the Beatdown, you want to open fire the Yoda because Yoda is restoring their base every turn that it sticks around. And so you have to take that off the battlefield, and you can accept the damage from Greedo. But if you are the control player, the opposite is true, is that Greedo presents a more direct threat. He's dealing 3 points of damage a turn to your base, so even though it might be non-resource advantageous to throw your open fire at Greedo, if you need to open fire something, open fire Greedo. Another example of a tactic is sequencing. Sequencing is difficult. I think that sequencing is beyond the order, beyond the scope of this particular episode. It's a whole topic in and of itself, but playing out your turn, knowing like what actions do I need to take now versus what actions can I wait on, those kinds of choices are important and frequently give you lots of value if you can sequence things correctly. And then sort of the ultimate example of that is taking the initiative, which I think is a really cool mechanic from SWU. And that is when you take the initiative, you guarantee that you go first next turn, but you can't do anything else this turn. And because of that, frequently you will be in a position where you can take the initiative, but there's still like a couple of marginal things that you could do to try and squeeze a little bit more value out of the turn. And you need to be able to evaluate your current state and understand, do I need to take the initiative because I have to do something right away next turn versus no, I don't want to leave value on the table. I want to be able to like spend my 1 to activate my Vader leader ability, or spend my 1 to activate my Tarkin leader ability, or swing with my regional governors into your base for 1. And
Okay.
these are informed by Who's the Beatdown, but these are frequently beyond the scope of Who's the Beatdown.
So, who is the Beatdown informs your strategy. Strategy is
Yes.
what you're trying to do, and tactics is
Yes.
how you are trying to do. So it's one step
Exactly.
removed from the Beatdown.
Right.
Okay.
And there are tactics that lean more into being the Beatdown versus not. So, for example, I would argue that the Han nonsense leans more towards being the control because you are throwing away cards for value. But there's a lot of circumstances in which that's not, where like you're trying to accelerate to 6 and get out this really powerful unit such that you can close the door on your opponent and win, versus the other approach is I'm playing a big unit to try and hold the board. If I have this big unit, my opponent has to deal with it. And that's the control mindset of I'm playing a big unit so my opponent has to deal with it, versus the Beatdown mindset of I'm playing a big unit because I want to attack my opponent's base.
Okay. So, all right, I think I've got a pretty good grasp, and hopefully dear listener does as well, of tactics and how they inform or apply strategy, and how strategy is informed by the Beatdown. But that doesn't... that I understand the connection, but okay, so if I'm the Beatdown, or if I'm control,
Right.
From whence? Like what's the next step there?
Well, I think that it's important to identify this idea of where this comes from. Is when you are the Beatdown, every turn that goes by, every action, everything that happens is taking you further away from victory. So if you are going to win, you have to win now. Whereas the control, every turn that happens, every action that happens, that the longer the game goes on, the more likely it is that you have survived, and having survived, that you will win. So being the Beatdown is all about trying to throw your resources away as efficiently as possible to win now. You want to turn the game into a race where I'm dealing damage to your base, you're dealing damage to my base, but because I'm faster, I will win that race. As the Beatdown, you frequently have to make bad trades. So an example of a bad trade is if I have to throw 2 of my units into your Sentinel to unlock my ability to continue attacking your base, I will do that. Rather than, like, as the control perspective, if your opponent has a Sentinel unit out that you can't get through right now, that's okay. You just are waiting turns to get your bigger unit out so that you can trade more efficiently into, cell block guard.
So I feel like the two things you just said are somewhat at cross purposes, and
Yeah.
maybe that's just the second order step. Identify the Beatdown, be good at playing.
Yes.
Is efficiently, you said that as the Beatdown, you're trying to efficiently trade resources to win now, but also
Yes.
sometimes, I mean, a bad trade feels inefficient.
It is absolutely inefficient, but as the beatdown, this is the essence of why it's a strategic level choice and not a tactical level choice. Is that you, as the beatdown, are trying to kill your opponent as quickly as possible, and if the only line that you can take that will kill your opponent is throwing your units into their sentinel unit inefficiently, then you take it.
Okay.
On the other hand, because you are going to have less resource, you are going to have more resources now, but you are going to have, as time goes on, your resources will matter less and less and less. And by resources here, I'm not referring to the physical like resources that you have that allow you to play cards, but I'm talking about your cards, your all the tools that your deck has. Your resources are, you have bigger resources now, but less resources later, and ideally you want them to stretch to the point where you can kill your opponent.
Okay.
And
Okay.
if
But
you're hyper advantaged as the beatdown, then you just attack into their face and you win and you don't have to think about it. But frequently as the beatdown, there's going to come a point where your opponent is on low base HP. You need to make a call about, do I wait or do I press my advantage? And having made that call, you need to be able to follow through on it. So, it's turn 5. Your opponent has like a reasonably sized sentinel. Let's say that you're playing against like a Tarkin, like a green-black deck with something else in. It's very likely that the Gladiator Star Destroyer is going to come down next turn and make one of their other units a sentinel. So if you can clean up an arena and make sure that you can get in the next turn, you might have to do that.
okay. All right. Well, that sounds awful. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't want to be the beatdown. I recognize the need that sometimes I will be because I gravitate. I will often be because I gravitate towards mid-range decks. But my natural comfort is control. So, mindful of who is the beatdown, how do I play as control?
If you are the control, you are trying to not lose. The assumption is that every turn that goes on, you are getting further and further ahead because your cards are bigger, because you are the control. That is what it means to be the control, is that the longer the game goes on, the more advantage that you have. So that means that everything that you can do to extend the length of the game is probably in your favor. And I say probably up to a point, where that up to a point is really important, because at a certain point as the control, you need to win so that your opponent, like imagine that you're playing against a Sabine player. They're doing 1 point of damage to your base every turn, period. And so at a certain point, you need to just win now. I mean, like maybe you have enough, base health gain that you can ignore it, but pretending that you don't, or it's taxing that in a way that you would prefer not to. At a certain point, you do have to switch, and you do have to, okay, I'm going to win the game now. But up until that point, it's all about trying not to lose. So how do you make the game take longer? You want to keep the board clear, generally, of your opponent's cards. You want to keep the board clear of your opponent's cards because that means that nothing is happening. If they have cards on the board and you have cards on the board, then they can attack their cards into your cards, or they can, even worse, attack their cards into your base. So you're trying to, as the control, you're trying to keep the board clear. As the control, you're trying to prioritize keeping your base HP relatively high. And this is something where, relatively high, this SWU is new. I don't know how this is going to play out, but you want to make sure that you don't lose to like a lucky surprise strike. They play a Death Star Stormtrooper and then they surprise strike it into your base for 6 out of nowhere that you weren't expecting, and now you lose.
Okay.
So don't let that happen. Keep that base health up. Keep the base health up, and you do that by you're playing Sentinel units. You're attacking your units into their units, and you're just generally trying to make the game go longer until such a point that you have such a big advantage that you can still keep control of your board position and hit them. You don't want to run into a situation, although you might have to, where you're having to give up control of the board for getting points of damage into their base.
Yeah. So, one last question regarding
Yeah.
playing as control. How do you identify that turning point where you're pivoting from not losing to winning?
So in Magic, there's this concept of stabilized. You stabilized when you have big enough creatures on the board that your opponent doesn't have any good attacks anymore. At that point, you have stabilized. And what that means is that they can no longer make good attacks into you because in Magic, defender chooses blockers. But in SWU, you don't have that same luxury, right? Like if I drop Blizzard AT, it's a giant dude, but unless I give it Sentinel, you can just attack past it. So you will probably be in a situation in which you have stabilized when you feel reasonably confident about keeping whatever card they play that you can probably kill it.
And still have
with
something left over to throw at base.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Is because you are trying to keep the board clear, as long as you are not confident that whatever they can play you can kill, you have not stabilized yet.
Okay. As you're explaining this, I'm reworking the game in my head and realizing kind of where I think I lost. So, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I gravitate towards mid-range. When I'm playing against aggro, I'm control. When I'm playing against control, I'm the beatdown. But in theory, some third of games, I am the mid-range against the mid-range. One of us, even though we're both playing mid-range decks or in a mirror match even, I'm still one of us is still the beatdown. One of us is still control. How do I know which one I am?
And I think that this, an important note is, let's imagine that we're playing a perfectly mirror match. It's going to depend on the cards that you draw, in part. Is that depending on what cards show up in your hand, you might end up being forced into the beatdown role, or you might end up being forced into the control role, at least temporarily. And that can end up in some weird situations. So a common, to go back to the mid-range, you have this idea of drawing the wrong half of your deck, where half of your deck is more controlling and half of your deck is more beatdowny, and if you're drawing the wrong half of your deck, well, stinks. But to like,
good thing it's best 2 out of 3.
Yeah, exactly. In the sort of best Jeff Foxworthy, you might be the beatdown if.
Okay.
If you're not playing any removal, then you might be the beatdown.
Oh, I'm so excited. Keep going.
If your average unit cost is lower than your truck, you might be the beatdown. If the last time you were able to draw an extra card was when you were playing Pictionary last night, you might be the beatdown.
I haven't done YouTube Shorts yet, but I know I want to. Okay, that was amazing. Okay, so removal, the cost of your cards, how much removal you have, the cost of your cards, and you use and card advantage. How many cards you're drawing? Kind of, but it's all relative, right? So you also, I mean, again, this is just a general feel, right? It's an art, not a science.
Yes.
And so you can't necessarily guarantee it or play it this way. But in theory, in the abstract, with arbitrary points, you're drawing the wrong half of your deck in a mirror match. So you're the beatdown, you think, and yet your opponent is drawing an even worse half of your mirrored deck. And so it turns out, no, truly, they are the beatdown because you at least have some answers and they have...
Exactly.
Okay. Or you have some questions and they literally only have late game answers or something. Okay.
Right. So to go into this a little bit, why removal makes you the control is, if we go back, the control wants to keep the board clear, removal keeps the board clear. So if you're having removal, you are able to keep the board clear. With lower curve cards are less powerful later, but they're more powerful now. And so if you have a lower curve, if you're drawing cheaper cards, you are going to end up being more of the beatdown role. Whereas if you're drawing your higher cost cards, those cards will be more powerful when they come into play. And so you're trying to not die until the point where you can play those cards. And finally, the idea of card advantage, and I know we're jumping a little bit ahead, but if you're seeing more cards than your opponent, if you are ending up with more cards in play than your opponent, then you are in the control role. You tend to be in the control role. If you're drawing more cards, you tend to be in the control role because, again, if you're drawing more cards, you can play more cards in the future, but those cards aren't cards right now. Whereas if you are having more cards in play now, the cards that you have in play now are valuable now, and they may be less valuable in the future, so you might be more of the beatdown. So this is a reason why I feel like when you use the generic term card advantage, sometimes people use card advantage to mean I have more cards in play right now versus I have more cards in hand. And these terms are used interchangeably, but they actually have different implications for which role you should be trying to take on.
Okay. Okay. So, all right. So I think that's the medium version.
Mm-hmm.
Dear listener, if you want the long version, though I will acknowledge it's possible Ned and I have dragged this out longer than the actual length of the article, which is a reasonably short article. You can just Google or search on your search engine of choice, DuckDuckGo, Who's the Beatdown. I'll link it in the episode descriptions on both the podcast and YouTube. It's a great read. It has lots of links to Magic cards. If you're not into Magic, the underlying theory is still sound, but hopefully, if you've never heard the theory, Who's the Beatdown, hopefully you're one step closer to playing competitively. And if you're very familiar with Who is the Beatdown, hopefully Ned provided some texture and nuance to the question that you hadn't heard before. All right, second segment, Ned and I are going to talk about advantage. Ned mentioned card advantage in the first segment. I have some sense of what the word means in English and games. I assume advantage means I'm deriving more value from my deck, from my units, than my opponent is. If you want to be the control player, you're eking out more value. You're getting, and if you're getting more value than your opponent, you're gaining advantage over them. But we hear a lot of terms, I hear a lot of terms bandied around like card advantage and tempo, but I don't actually have a clear idea of what those are. So Ned has told me that there are distinct sets of types of advantage. And and again, much like I make Swooty Beat for me and everybody else benefits, I'm making this podcast partly just so that I can ask Ned to teach me how to play card games and then everybody else benefits. But Ned, walk me through advantage.
So I'm going to start with a brief history lesson, and I promise it won't be super boring, but back in ye olde days when the card games were new, people would look at a deck that was a control deck or something similar to a control deck. There was a deck called the deck back in the Dawn Ages, and people would look at it, they'd go, what the heck, how is this good? Because most of the deck does not help you to win. It does not do anything to win. The vast majority of the deck is focused around not losing. And it's been a while since I've played team sports, but from what I recall of my pickup basketball days, playing to not lose is generally speaking not a good strategy. But in card games, it turns out that it is. And so people came up with a language, a way to talk about things that they see that you can gain an advantage in. And by having these specific kinds of advantage, you can press these advantages to maybe win. So most of the time, the idea behind an advantage is that in a lot of the card game, things are symmetric, but you are breaking the symmetry in your own favor.
Like enchant worlds.
Yes.
Okay.
Right,
So
where it
taking
affects both
advantage
people.
of setting up situations that are symmetrical, but you're prepared to take advantage of.
Right.
Okay.
But these are fundamental to the rules of the game.
Okay.
So I'm going to start off with the most easy to gain and lose, and that is tempo advantage.
Oh, okay. Wait. Before you start talking about tempo.
Whoa. Yeah.
So we have, how many kinds of advantage are you going to talk about tonight?
I'm going to talk specifically about 4 kinds of advantage, and then there's a hidden 5th kind of advantage that I might talk about depending on how long I go on in the other kinds of advantage.
I say we talk about it forever. Okay. So the 4 types of advantage, can you make them ascend or descend in an interesting way?
I think that I can. So I'm going to start off by talking about the most ephemeral advantages, and then I'm going to go down into the most sort of deep advantages but have the longest time to come online.
Okay.
So the most...
You said tempo.
Tempo is the most ephemeral advantage. So that means that it's very easy to gain and lose it. So in a lot of games, both in a lot of games where it's I go, you go, both players have the same number of turns. In SWU, that's not really true. We both have the same number of turns, but we don't necessarily have the same number of actions. But I'm going to start off by talking about the same number of turns, and then I'm going to move into the same number of actions. So if we both have the same number of turns, the faster that I can play my stuff out, I have a tempo advantage because my cards are able to act for longer than your card, or able to act earlier, so there's a longer duration of time that they are able to act for than your cards. So if I play a 3-cost unit on turn 3 and you play a 3-cost unit on, or turn 2, which is when you're supposed to be playing a 3-cost unit, then you have
I feel like
tempo
we're going to be in
advantage.
like set 5 before we completely internalize the n-1, n+1 nature of resources
I
versus
keep
turns.
tripping over it. It's really, I think it's really good, and
Yeah.
and again, topic for another day. But
Play more good stuff sooner is absolutely
yeah,
a great design choice, but it still makes I have n turns versus n+1 resources. So, okay,
yes,
but
you are getting a tempo advantage because on turn 3 you are able to attack with your unit, and I am not able to attack with my unit. So you
sorry,
have
say that
gained.
again. So you
So
have
if
on
I
turn 3
have
you play a 3-cost unit.
so on turn 2 you played a 2-cost unit. You played a 3-cost unit because magic.
Yep.
Or actually no, that's just resource of the game. On turn 2 you played a 3-cost unit. On turn 3 I played a 3-cost unit. You are able to attack me with your 3-cost unit, and I am not able to attack you with my 3-cost unit on turn 3 because I have lost a tempo advantage. So you have 1 attack worth of tempo on me. So exhausting and readying is examples of tempo advantage, where if you're exhausting a card, you are losing that card a tempo for a turn, right? Like if I am exhausting your unit, you have lost 1 turn out of being able to use that unit. If I am readying a unit, I have an additional turn worth of attacking out of the unit. If I have an ambush unit, ambush is a tempo keyword. It means that I get to immediately get value out of the unit, whereas if you compare it to the same unit without ambush, you have to wait to get that value.
Okay.
And so
So
tempo is now versus later.
okay. So I'm playing Grand Inquisitor. I have the
Yep.
ability to deal 2 damage to one of my units to ready it. That
Yep.
readying is gaining me tempo advantage.
Yes. Yeah.
Hit points are not tempo advantage, so at the cost of
No.
some other value. But
Right.
pure tempo wise, that's what Grand Inquisitor's whole premise is lose hit
Yeah.
points, gain tempo advantage by way of ready.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of time, and it's impossible to talk about things in a vacuum because most of the time you can't get something for free, but we have to pretend that you can get things for free. We have to kind of neglect everything. Taking again, my physics background is showing here is that you're trying to neglect everything other than the variables that exactly you're trying to study, and then you pretend that everything else is the same.
Okay. Well, that's great. I'm great at pretend.
Yeah.
So okay, but that I mean I come closer to an accounting background. So you are moving money from one department to another. You're moving advantage from one kind of advantage and exchanging it for a different kind of advantage. But we can look in the specific kind of advantage and say I've gained this kind. I've gained tempo at the cost of
Right.
hit point advantage or whatever that is. But I've gained. Grand Inquisitor has just looking in the department
Purely
of
in the tempo column. Yeah.
In the tempo column, I've gained tempo. That's
Yes.
it. I'm up.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Similarly, Bamboozle is an example of a tempo card, but
Right.
it's got other stuff packed in, right?
And you're
Like,
playing
you
a
are-
card, which I
Right.
assume will tie into something called Card Advantage or something. But you said
Yes,
there's
we're
many
going to get
kinds of
there.
card
We're going to get
advantage.
there. Yeah. So tempo advantage is really ephemeral because it's every unit has tempo every turn, and so like a tempo advantage that you've gained now will tend to go away, right? Like if I have gained a tempo advantage temporarily next turn, that tempo advantage is probably like the effects of that tempo advantage have been seen, but unless I have continual like readying shenanigans, I am not able to continue to profit from that. I have gained my profit and we're moving on. So that's why it's the most kind of ephemeral.
And it
advantage.
just ebbs and flows. You can gain it,
Yeah.
but you can also lose it real quick. And
Yeah.
okay. Is there a
At the
second?
Yes. So at the next level of solidness, we have board advantage. So board advantage is we're looking at the units that I have on the board, and we're looking at the units that you have on the board. And if my stuff is better than your stuff, then I have board advantage. So let's pretend it's turn 3, or turn 2, you have a Disabling Fang Viper, and I have the Millennium Falcon. The Disabling Fang Viper is a 3/2. The Millennium Falcon is a 3/4. So I can trade my Millennium Falcon into your Disabling Fang Viper and I will still have a unit, and you will not.
So at the start of the
because
turn, you have board advantage.
yes, so board advantage is why big cards are good. If I am playing like the Blizzard AT-AT, that is a big card, and so that card is kind of worth more than your cards. And some people try and compress that, and they talk about it as card advantage, that like the Blizzard AT-AT is worth more than one card. But I think that muddies the waters a little bit. And fundamentally, I think that it's helpful to decompose this, is that cards that have big stats give them board advantage. And this is why Overwhelming Barrage, one of the reasons why Overwhelming Barrage sees a huge amount of play, is because you are getting board advantage because you are taking your unit, you are making it bigger, and then also you are removing a huge amount of material from your opponent's board, right? Like it's a big swing in board advantage. Board advantage tends to be ephemeral because units die. So like if I have a big unit, it will tend to die, and then when it dies, I no longer have that board advantage that it was giving me. But because of the nature of SWU combat, where I can choose to attack your units, that is another reason why board advantage in SWU tends to be more ephemeral, is that if you have a big unit, I can just attack it down, whereas in other card games, if I have a big unit, I get to choose whether or not it defends. And so you cannot just eliminate
But
it.
unless I have a big unit, I'm just going to be slamming multiple big units into that
Right.
Blizzard AT-AT and
Yep.
losing my relative board advantage to get there.
Right. And this is the thing, is that board advantage can be really hard to evaluate. Is would you rather have, to go back to like the board state that we have previously, 3 pretty good units? I mean, like I would say that the Yoda with a lightsaber,
Entrenched Yoda with a
have
lightsaber, Kanan Jarrus, and
Yeah.
the Lothal Insurgent.
Lothal. Yeah.
He's a chump, but collectively, that's a nice little squad.
Right. And I would say that, like, in that example where we had just those cards versus just my Blizzard AT-AT, you had board advantage. But then when I played Overwhelming Barrage, I now had board advantage because your units all died, and I had an 11-11.
How the turntables.
Rare to go. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why board advantage, it's ephemeral, but it doesn't go away automatically. Like a tempo advantage will go away on its own, whereas a board advantage will tend to not.
Okay.
So the next level of ephemera is resource advantage. So a resource advantage is pretty solid. So again, we're thinking about this in terms of players have the same. By default, players can have the same number of resources. If I want, I can have 3 resources on turn 2, and you can have 3 resources on turn 2. But if I am able to do what I want to with less resources, with fewer resources, then I'm gaining an advantage. So the classic example here is vanquishing the 97th Legion. If I vanquish the 97th Legion, I have spent a 5-cost card to defeat your 7-cost card. So you have spent 7 resources on cards, I have spent 5 resources on cards, and therefore if I can use my other 2 resources to do something, I've gained a resource advantage.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is that distinct from or so the super laser technician, right?
Yes.
That
Gives you a
dies a
resource
gain a
advantage.
resource. Is that resource?
Yes.
Also resource? Just
That
having
is
more resources?
Having more resources is resource advantage. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Having more resources. Readying resources is resource advantage. If you're using Boba's leader ability to ready a resource, you're gaining resources, right? Like you have more resources to spend. But the key about resource advantage is that resource advantage only matters if you are able to use it. So any turn where you are not using all of your resources, you are losing resource advantage, right? Like imagine that it's turn 4, we both have 5 resources, and you play a 3 and a 2, and I play a 4, right? I have wasted 1 resource. That
if you
resource
don't
is
have a
gone
1 to
forever.
follow. If that's
If
the
I don't
sum
have a one
total
to
of what
play.
we played, then you've wasted
Right.
1 resource. Okay.
And it might be that, my 4 is better than your 2 and a 3, but I have wasted this symmetric thing that we had that it may have been the correct play, but I am not gaining resource advantage by doing that. And so this is why you always want to spend your resources every turn. Any turn where you have like a significant number of dead resources is really bad. And to go back to last episode where we talked about curves, this is why you need plays on early turns, because if you don't have a play on 2, you don't have a play on 3, what are you doing with your life?
Right.
But also you've
You're
wasted
losing
5
resources.
resources. Yeah.
Is that also losing tempo?
Yes. Yeah. You are also losing tempo. Is that you had 5 resources that you could have used to do things, but let's imagine that you don't play anything on 2, but on 3 you play 5 resources worth of units because magic. Because that's the way that it works.
Not lowercase m magic, right?
Yeah, lowercase m, not the Magic the Deckmaster game by Richard Garfield, PhD. But you are play. If I magically am able to play 5 resources worth of units on turn 3, and you were able to on turn 2 play a 2-cost resource, and on turn 2-cost unit, and then on 3 you were able to play a 3-cost resource.
It's not magic. Unit. You're my only hope, right? Like 3 into 5.
Yeah, 3. Yeah, if I had that 2-cost unit able to take action on turn 3, and you did not. So I gained a tempo advantage with my 2-cost unit because it was able to act when you were not to. But we have now, for whatever reason, we have achieved parity on resources. But yeah, You're My Only Hope is a good call out there.
Okay. I mean, still, we've yet to make it a good card, but yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, I don't know that I
100%
grasp quite the distinction between playing when playing a card that is perfectly on curve is a resource advantage versus a tempo advantage. But I'm close. But that goes back, I think, to that idea that why leaders who allow you to round out your curve, those are the ones, they're essentially allowing you to take full resource, make sure you're always at least maintaining parity on resource advantage.
As long as it's doing something positive, right? Like if you're wasting resources on something that does literally nothing, then or less than nothing, like yes, you're spending all of your resources, but you're spending them poorly. Like you
still want to be efficiently casting good stuff. So
right. And it's another reason why resupply and super laser technician can be really tricky is that or at least super laser technician can sometimes be tricky because you don't get to control when you get that extra resource. So you might gain the resource advantage, but you might not be able to take advantage of it until later. Okay. And so you gained a resource advantage, but you're not able to use it. So is it really an advantage? Probably not.
Okay. All right. So what is the most concrete advantage?
The most concrete advantage is card advantage, and that is because it can never be taken away from you.
That's cards in your hand.
Is players have the same number of cards. If I have more cards than you do, or if you have fewer cards because I made you have fewer cards for some reason, or if I am able to trade, and again, here we're kind of fudging things a little bit, but if I'm able to use some of my cards such that I am using one of my cards and I am affecting multiple of your cards, I'm killing multiple of your cards, then I am gaining a card advantage. So for example, if I use open fire on your unit, I have traded 1 card for one of your cards. If I am using mission briefing, the reason why you would play mission briefing is I am spending one of my cards and I am drawing 2 cards. So now I have 1 more card in my hand than I would have otherwise. So I'm up a card. Okay. If I use overwhelming barrage to destroy 2 to 3 of your units, I have gained a board advantage because I now have a better unit on the board. You have lost board advantage because you now no longer have as many units as you had on the board. And I have probably gained a card advantage because I have used one of my cards, Overwhelming Barrage, to trade for multiple of your cards.
Okay. I'm still lost. I play a card, cause you to discard a card.
Yes.
You're saying card advantage can't be taken away.
Right. Because
but I just took one of your cards away.
You did, but you spent a card, right? So like if I have 3 cards and you have 3 cards and you spend a card to make me discard a card, now we both have 2 and 2. We both have the same number of cards. If I spend a card and I make you discard 2 cards, you have lost card advantage slightly. Right. Or you could think of it as I gained card advantage.
Okay. Hey, but isn't that not being taken away? I'm not.
I mean, I hear you. But like you have to take a specific action, I guess, to take away card advantage.
There's no in-game mechanic that allows me to fight for card advantage. I can't choose. there's no choices outside of the cards that I put in my deck. But I mean, I can't. It's not like Netrunner where I can just dedicate actions to drawing more cards. Like
Exactly.
I get the
right.
2 that the game gives me, and I mean every card breaks
But
the
I think,
rules.
yeah, but I think that this is actually something is that there is an in-game mechanic to gain card advantage, and that is not resourcing. Is if I draw 2 and I don't resource, then I am gaining a card advantage, right? And this is one of the reasons why aggro decks and like mid-range decks choosing when to stop resourcing is huge. Because if I'm making a decision to stop resourcing, I am gaining card advantage on you every turn that I am not resourcing, which I think is actually really interesting.
Yeah. Interesting enough that I'm sure we'll do a segment on it at some point.
Yes.
So okay, or maybe now.
Yeah.
But okay, so that's a trade of resources, right? And so,
Yes.
and when I'm playing a card, I'm losing my card advantage. But if I'm looking at like resupply, I play a card that costs me card advantage. I mean, anytime you're playing a card, right? That's the classic idea that every card costs 1 card, every ability costs 1 card. So
this is why Metal Ceremony is not as good as it looks. Like it's free, but it costs you a card, and a card is worth more than +1/+1 on 3 different units.
Is it 1 card versus? I mean, +3/+3 is a lot.
Well, yeah, but it's on 3 different units.
Okay.
We can fight about this. We can fight
sure.
Right.
So, but you're exchanging one type of advantage,
yes,
with resupply, for I'm playing that card. I've lost card advantage by playing a card, but I've gained resource advantage.
Right, and I may have lost board advantage also, right? Because I didn't play anything to the board on 3, so I may have.
But like looking at Metal Ceremony,
right?
It costs you a card, so it costs you card advantage. It doesn't cost you any resource advantage.
No.
Since it didn't cost you any resources, you absolutely could be, in theory, playing cards. Maybe cards with ambush, but you had cards that attacked. You still have cards, so you are essentially. But to your physics comment about isolating variables, it costs 0, so we don't have to worry about resource advantage. It does. It doesn't. We don't have to worry about board advantage. We are literally just exchanging card advantage for
board advantage.
Board advantage, and that's it. Those are the only 2 columns that matter, one to the other. So, okay, and I assume that's just really what a lot of this card evaluation boils down to. Is why people can argue about whether Metal Ceremony is good or not. Is that trade a good trade?
Exactly, right? Like, is resupply a good trade? And it's contextual, right? Like, if I'm resupplying, if it's turn 9 and I'm resupplying, I'm not gaining, like, I'm going from 9 resources to 11 resources next turn. And maybe that's significant, but it's probably not. It probably doesn't matter that I have 11 resources. I don't think I'm going to be able to spend them all. So, like, I'm spending a card to gain me an advantage in a column that doesn't matter, because I'm going to waste that advantage. But, if I'm resupplying on 3 and I'm not worried about your board, then I go from 3 to 5 and I am now gaining a resource advantage. Every turn I can have more resources than you do because I resupplied. And if I'm able to efficiently use my resupply, I can turn those resources into a board advantage where I'm playing bigger units than you are. And so my bigger units are probably going to be better than your units. And so I can gain a board advantage. And then once I have a board advantage, maybe I can kill you.
Okay, so, and then I think we can all agree that in a hypothetical scenario where I'm playing aggro, hero aggro, and I'm at, Sabine, I'm able to get out 2 1-cost cards in the round 1.
Yep.
And then in round 2, I'm able to get out some sort of 3-cost ambush that doesn't cost anything. I attack with 3 cards. They all survive. I play Metal Ceremony. Yep. Metal Ceremony in round 2 for 3, I think we can all agree is a good trade, right?
Yeah.
Just because the board presence at that moment in round 2, the 3/3 of board presence is great. Whereas,
that's huge. That's if in that specific context, yes, Metal Ceremony is absolutely gold. Right.
Whereas if it's round 10, right, and we have 9 resources, and that's the card that I've got in my hand, 3/3 is not worth the card. You'd rather when your opponent's using a card, regardless of resources, they're using a card to drop a home 1 or a Devastator or an Avenger, right? Like that's what are you doing with your turn? You're giving 3/3 to 3 dudes or 1/1 to 3 dudes. So So how do you figure out like when you have optional trades, right? Like at some point, a trade becomes, forget the deck building component. Is Metal Ceremony worth putting in my deck? How many Metal Ceremonies is worth putting in my deck? But
Yeah.
sometimes a card, a Metal Ceremony is a card that you keep if you think you can play it on turn 2. It is a card you resource if you don't think you can play it on turn 6, 7, 8.
Yes.
But there's a pivot point. And so when you are trading one type of advantage for another type of advantage, how do you identify that inflection point where it goes from being a worthwhile trade to something that's you're asking for too much? You said get good,
right? Get good, right? Like there are. I mean, like you can say in general when you are trading for one kind of an advantage, you only want to trade for that kind of advantage if it's worth it, right? Like if I am, let's imagine that I'm waylaying your unit, right? When I'm waylaying your unit, I'm spending 3 resources and a card, and I'm bouncing a card back to your hand, a unit back to your hand, and then you have to play that unit again, right? So I've cost you tempo because you've lost, depending on when I play the waylay during the turn, right? Like if I play the waylay before you attack with the unit, then you've lost a tempo for a turn for that unit. It can't attack this turn, and maybe another tempo, maybe it can't attack next turn because, depending on how you play it. I may gain resources. If I'm waylaying your 7 cost unit, then I have gained effectively 4 resources because I'm forcing you to spend 7 resources again that you have previously spent.
Right.
So I'm getting a resource advantage. If I am waylaying a 5 cost unit, those things are still true, but the odds that you're going to be able to that it's going to be a significant harm on you to replay that 5 cost unit are
the card advantage that you've lost by playing.
Yes.
They don't lose a card. The card advantage you've lost.
They don't lose a card. Yeah.
Is and the resource advantage that you've gained of 3 versus 5 is so much smaller that you're really relying on that tempo, and maybe the tempo wins you the game.
Maybe the tempo wins you the game, and maybe it doesn't. Change of Heart, I think, is another good one, right? Like Change of Heart is potentially giving you're trading a card for a temporary board and tempo advantage, right? Where you're taking their unit, you can attack with their unit, so you go from that unit was on their column and now it's on your column. If you can attack effectively with that unit and maybe like trade away that unit for something good, or maybe you can attack with that unit into your opponent's base and deal a lot of damage, it's worth it, but you're giving up like a card and 6 resources, and so the question is it worth it? I don't know. It depends. It depends on what the board state looks like. Consider the complete ridiculous case of waylaying. I waylay your Death Star Stormtrooper. Okay. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And maybe that's the right call, right? Like it might be a situation where you have identically 3 base health, and if I waylay your Death Star Stormtrooper, you can't attack with your Death Star Stormtrooper this turn, and I can win the game, or I can play my Sentinel unit, or I can do whatever. And it can be worth it in that circumstance, but it's...
I look forward to Tower Number 9 or Garbage Rollers or somebody posting a YouTube video where somebody wins by change of hearting a regional,
like a Cantina Braggart or something ridiculous,
something just trivial, where it's like, well, I need to do 2 and I can only do 2 by stealing your trivial pipsqueak for 6 resources. So I look forward to that YouTube video.
One other thing that I do want to talk about, and I talk about like the hidden 5th, and this is the idea of
have time.
Card
Hidden
advantage.
5th. Yeah.
Yes. All right. So this is pseudo card advantage. So this is you are taking a card and you are making it not worth anything for a while. So Entrenched, I think, is a perfect example of a pseudo card advantage card, where when I play Entrenched on your unit, or I am playing Entrenched on my own unit, I can make that unit worthless temporarily, because it can't attack the base. So imagine that like you have some big space unit and I have a whole ground army. When I entrench, I am effectively removing your big space unit, right? Like I'm killing it. I have gained, it is a 1-for-1 trade, but it's not a real 1-for-1 trade, right? Because as soon as I play a space unit, suddenly your giant entrenched Star Destroyer is valuable
even bigger
again.
Right. Or as I have subjected you to time and time again, overwhelming barrage on an entrenched overwhelming barrage on a unit of your own that was entrenched by your opponent feels delicious. Like that's just
it's amazing, right? Like so another example of this is big Sentinel units. Is that if I play Obi-Wan Kenobi, let's say, Obi-Wan is 4/6. reasonably big Sentinel unit, I might not have any good attacks into Obi-Wan Kenobi. So I might be gaining a pseudo tempo advantage, or I might be gaining a real tempo advantage. You're not able to attack with your cards, but you can. Sometimes people think of this as a pseudo card advantage, right?
You're saying if I play Obi-Wan Kenobi and
Yes.
you have nothing to run into it, I have gained
Yeah.
a pseudo tempo advantage.
No, you have gained a real tempo advantage. You have gained a real tempo advantage because my real units are in actuality not able to attack. But sometimes people classify this as like a pseudo card advantage, is that you have turned off my units. But as soon as Obi-Wan is gone, then my units can attack again. So they weren't killed. And this is, again, where I feel like it's important to be more precise about things, but I want to, you're going to encounter stuff on the street, so it's important that you learn it from me rather than from Johnny at the playground. Pseudo
card advantage is not real card advantage. It just represents
an idea that I am kind of trading one card for multiple of your cards in a way that makes them temporarily useless. And sometimes that's a tempo advantage, right? Like you can think of entrenched as being, it's a tempo advantage, or you can think of entrenched as being, in the
like so outmaneuver, right?
Yeah.
Like which just taps an entire lane. Exhausts an entire lane. That's
right. That's a pure tempo advantage, but people might say like, it's maybe pseudo card. Like I don't know people who would classify that as pseudo card advantage, but I think that people who would classify like Chewbacca making units temporarily Sentinel as pseudo card advantage, maybe. I don't know.
Okay.
Like, I think entrenched is the A number one. This is pseudo card advantage card rather than thinking of it as like infinite tempo advantage, because effectively an infinite temp. If you remove a card that is kind of infinite tempo advantage, you have gained. That person has lost infinite tempo off of that particular card.
Okay.
You can make that argument. I don't like that argument because that argument is kind of dumb, but one could make that argument.
Hey, you know what? I used to be a lawyer. Yeah. That's my jam, is dying on the hill of bad arguments. So sometimes you got nothing but bad arguments and you make them as best you can. So to wrap up our segment, Ned, not what's the best or what's the most important, but on a purely subjective good feels, what's your favorite of these advantages? Like which one do you just get happy?
I love cards. I mean, there's a reason why I put card advantage where I did, and that is I will die with handfuls of cards in my hands, and you have seen me do it, and I will continue to do it, and yes, I have gained card advantage, but at what price? It probably wasn't worth it. But by God, look at all these cards.
Yeah, right. I'm absolutely a board advantage guy, right? Like that's the Timmy. I don't care if my hand's empty if I've just got a big board. And that goes, I think, to my complete unwillingness to sack units or spend health to do things, because then I would have less, and I don't want to have less. I want to have more, right? Like the only thing that matters is the board. Everything else is potential.
Greatness at any price. I do want to do a tiny side note here about greed. I mentioned greed before, but greed is used as a shorthand for when you are trying to maximize an advantage at the cost of other things. So, if people will talk about like, oh, this is a greedy play. I am trying to let's talk about like playing greedy with an Academy Walker, right? Like what you are trying to do with an Academy Walker, which gives +1/+1 to all damage units, is you are losing tempo because you're not playing the Academy Walker now. You might be losing resources if you're not playing the Academy Walker, and instead you're having to do a more inefficient combination of units. But you are trying to maximize that moment of board advantage that you get. And you have to play a little bit greedy because you have to try and get your advantages where you can get them. But too much greed will kill you because other people are able to maximize the advantages that you are giving up to try and be greedy. Another example of greed is how long do you hold Palpatine, right? Like, do you hold him until he can kill exactly 6 health worth of units, or are you content with just killing like 2 or 3 health worth of units to get that big Palpy advantage, that beautiful boy on the table?
Or I think even just a sequencing question is,
right.
Do you accept that you can do some damage without killing a unit versus running a card? If you open with a Palpatine, you can do the 6.
Yeah.
if you're going to run something into somebody so that you can kill with the 6, but that gives them a turn to name Palpatine off a regional governor or whatever. And so now you just don't. Okay.
You greeted yourself to death. Yeah.
Okay. Don't be greedy.
Yeah. Disagree. Be greedy, but be greedy responsibly.
Right. Okay. All right. Don't talk to Johnny on the playground, and be greedy responsibly. That's our moralistic takes from this segment. And that's all she wrote. Again, this was episode number 4 of The Force Unlimited. We're recording December 10th, 2023. I assume if we look at a Venn diagram of our very few Force Unlimited subscribers, we see you, thank you, Force Unlimited subscribers, and those who celebrate Hanukkah, I think that Venn diagram at the center consists only of my wife. But for any of our listeners, if you celebrate Hanukkah, dear listener, from my family to yours, happy Hanukkah. But only from my family. Ned's family doesn't care about you.
Oh, no. My family, we care about trains and train-related objects. So in the event that you are some kind of hyper-intelligent future train listening to this, happy winter holidays.
Dear listener, if you have any thoughts about the episode, please reach out, podcast@swoodb.com. Ned, do you have any thoughts about the episode?
I do. Don't listen to that Johnny boy, and Palpy is my beautiful child.
Oh, okay. Awesome. I love Palpy too. All right. With that, dear listener, we'll see you in 2 weeks.